I'm not as old as I look. And I'll explain the cane in a minute, but I need to make a sad correction about what J.R. mentioned. I think he's got a little bit of dated information on us. We no longer have the Beagle. It died a year and a half ago. That's really sad. That's okay. But we still have the Labrador, and also another update is here's the good news is our 4 sons, 3 of them are married, and among them we have 3 granddaughters. So that's much better news than having a Beagle, even though I really loved her, but she doesn't quite compare. Well, thank you for the opportunity to speak to you tonight. You have a great lineup this year, and I'm kind of impressed that you got me up here. I don't know why, but I'm grateful. Thank you for that, JR. I appreciate being here. I use a cane right now. It's a temporary situation. I had surgery in December, a knee surgery, because I weighed about 50 pounds more than I do now a year ago. And I was spending a lot of time in Athens, Greece in 2015. In fact, I made my 7th trip back there on the day after Christmas. So I got lots of frequent flyer miles. I was working at the National Library of Greece in Athens, examining ancient Greek New Testament manuscripts for the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts, my institute. And then we had a team of 7 or 8 people who would work there all summer for 90 days, working full-time digitizing these manuscripts. We have a contract with the National Library of Greece to digitize all of their Greek New Testament manuscripts. It's about 300 manuscripts, over 150,000 pages of manuscripts to digitize. And I had the great privilege of examining these. I write up an autopsy on each one of these manuscripts. It takes about 2 or 3 hours to write up a pretty fairly descriptive statement about what each manuscript is all about. And I'm going to present to the National Library in May about a 1,000-page document on the description of these manuscripts that they have. In this last year, we've also discovered 17 New Testament manuscripts, but I'll tell you about that in a minute. So the cane is temporary, and on December 26th, I flew back to Greece. The doctor told me I had to wait at least a couple weeks before I could fly after the surgery. And the National Library doesn't have any elevator, but the manuscript room is upstairs. This last summer, as I worked there, somebody had vandalized the air conditioning and electricity, and so I worked all summer without any air conditioning. Athens is about the temperature and humidity of Dallas. It was about 95 to 100 degrees in the room every day, so that's probably why I lost all the weight. I still have a long ways to go, as you can tell, but nevertheless, we won't get into that topic tonight except maybe once. So I had to go up and down these stairs, 60 steps, to get up to the manuscript room, and that really tore my knee up still. So I'm in physical therapy, and I am juicing this for what I can. I get disabled parking. I've got a pass through July, so I got to park in your very best spot right outside the building here. And, I walk with a cane, get as much sympathy as I can. Even women open the door for me, so I'm doing well. But I really don't like to lecture sitting down, so I'm standing tonight, and I'm on a strong painkiller. So if I sound like, if you don't understand anything I'm saying, we're going to blame it on that. All right, that's enough of an introduction. And so now we get into the very topic that I wanted to address. How badly has the Bible been corrupted? The Bible has been corrupted. This is a fact. And what I mean by that is that the copies that were done by hand for 1,500 years until the time of the printing press, every single one of them differs from every single other manuscript of the Bible, and in particular the New Testament, which is what I'll be talking to you about tonight. Here's a photograph of a leaf from the oldest manuscript of Paul's letters in existence, P46, which is both housed in Dublin, Ireland, and at the University of Michigan. We photographed this in 2013 and 2014. and we're getting it published in a couple of years. The leaf here, which is really remarkable, and I'm just going to explain this one, but this is the oldest manuscript of Paul that we have in existence, about AD 200. There's 86 leaves that are still in existence from this manuscript, and this manuscript has, the page you're looking at here ends, Ephesians concludes on this page, and Galatians begins right after it. Now, most of you, if you know your Bibles, know that's the wrong order. Or maybe it's the right order and we got it wrong. Gosh, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I'll take 30 more seconds. One of the fascinating things about these manuscripts that I've been studying is that once the book form was invented that we have today, and I'll explain that in a little bit, they had to raise some questions about what's the order of New Testament books. Up until that time, they had the scroll. You couldn't have more than 1 or 2 books put in a scroll. All of a sudden, with this form of book that I'll get into, now you could put more than 1 book in there. Well, what's the order going to be? Paul's letters are organized by their length, from the longest down to the shortest, except that Ephesians comes after Galatians and Hebrews goes at the very end. Hebrews was always associated with Paul, whether it was by him or not. Except in this one manuscript, Hebrews comes right after Romans and Ephesians is before Galatians. Fascinating stuff to think about. But we won't get into that because you guys haven't given me nearly enough time to talk to you. So, all right. So how badly has the Bible been corrupted? Let me begin by quoting from that great scholar, Dan Brown, and his conclusions about this. The Bible has evolved through countless translations, editions, and revisions. History has never had a definitive version of the book. Well, you've all heard that, or maybe you've even said that at Starbucks, at the office, at the water cooler, in the gym. People are constantly saying, hasn't the Bible been translated and retranslated so many times we can't possibly get back to the original? When I was a Christian in junior high school, I got an RSV for a Christmas present, and I began to read the beginning of it, and it said it was a revision of the King James in a series of several revisions, and I thought, didn't they go back to the original? Don't we have the original manuscripts? And it was an existential crisis for my faith. In junior high school, I thought, gosh, I guess the Bible's been translated and retranslated, and they throw away the old manuscripts, and then they just revise it from then on. How can we possibly get back to the original? So that kind of piqued my interest in this area, and I've spent the rest of my life trying to figure out what's actually going on. Well, let me get beyond the novelist Dan Brown. Atheists are also joining the chorus about this. C.J. Werleman, I'm going to back up here and just tell you a little bit more about him. C.J. Werleman is an atheist. This book, Jesus Lied, he was only human. He's got Jesus hooked up to a lie detector. He likes to write provocatively titled and provocatively pictured books. His first one was, God Hates You, Hate Him Back. That's pretty provocative. And it's also ironic. This is a book by an atheist. God hates you? What God? He probably should have titled it, Nothing Hates You, Hate Nothing Back, but I don't think it would have sold. So he writes this book, Jesus Lied, he was only human after all. And he says, we do not have any of the original manuscripts of the Bible. The originals are lost. We don't know when and we don't know by whom. What we have are copies of copies. He's right so far on all of this. Then he says, in some instances, the copies we have are 20th generation copies. I have no idea where he got that from. I know where he got the rest of his information from, though, and we'll see that source in just a minute. Muslims also are joining the chorus, and this is a far more serious attack on the reliability of the text of the Bible by M.M. al-Azmi, who is a British Muslim, a very popular writer. In his book, The History of the Quranic Text from Revelation to Compilation, he compares it with the Bible. He makes this rather profound statement that if it's true, we might as well just all leave here as non-believers. The Orthodox Church, and by this he doesn't mean the Eastern Orthodox Church, but what we would call orthodoxy, or what the basic truth of the gospel is, being the sect which eventually established supremacy over all the others, stood in fervent opposition to various ideas, also known as heresies, which were in circulation. And these heresies were part of the original New Testament, is what al-Azmi is arguing. These included adoptionism, the notion that Jesus was not God, but a man, and only a man. Docetism, the opposite view that he was God and not man. And separationism. that the divine and human elements of Jesus Christ were two separate beings. In each case, this sect, the one that would rise to become the Orthodox Church, deliberately corrupted the Scriptures so as to reflect its own theological visions of Christ while demolishing that of all rival sects. If that's true, we should just kiss the gospel away, kiss Christianity away, because we have no idea what we should believe about Jesus, since there's hopeless contradictions among the original authors. And the church in later centuries, Al-Azmi argues in the 4th century, finally decided, let's get rid of all these other manuscripts that don't tell the version of Jesus that we want to. Well, these people are not New Testament scholars. I've cited 3 people that are a novelist, an atheist, a Muslim. They're not the ones who do the research in this. They have a source. They actually have multiple sources, but this is the most popular one, and it's a book by Bart Ehrman called Misquoting Jesus, the story behind who changed the Bible and why. I want to tell you a little bit of background on this book and this author. And by the way, let me start by saying Bart Ehrman is a friend of mine. We've known each other for 34 years. We've worked together on projects. We see each other every year at what's called the Society of Biblical Literature Conference. And he's not an evil guy. He's a really nice fellow, actually. He wrote a book in 2005 called Misquoting Jesus. And this is a book that popularizes what scholars have argued for a long time about what the text of the New Testament is all about. It's really the first popular book that treats the text of the New Testament. And it was Ehrman's first book that became a New York Times bestseller. Since that time, every popular book he has written is a New York Times bestseller, especially because of this book, which is his area of specialty. Let me give you a little background on him. He's a Moody Bible Institute graduate. He's a Wheaton College graduate. Those are 2 very fine evangelical schools. And he was fascinated by the Greek text of the New Testament and about the scribes who are correcting and changing the text, and how could he possibly get back to the original. So he decided to go to Princeton Seminary and study under Bruce Metzger, who was one of the greatest biblical scholars of the 20th century and a very fine evangelical scholar. And so Bart, at the time, was an evangelical. He studied under Metzger, got his master's degree under Metzger in textual criticism, that discipline of trying to examine these manuscripts and see what they're all about and trying to get back to the original wording. Then he decided to pursue a PhD, and he got a PhD under Metzger in textual criticism. He was Metzger's last doctoral student. I met Bart in his first year of PhD studies. At the time, he was still an evangelical, although he had abandoned inerrancy, and he was moving a little bit further to the left. But now, today, and probably for all of the 21st century, he has become an agnostic. He has actually said, if there is a God, it's certainly not the God of the Bible, because that's a Nazi-like deity. So you can see there's a little bit of animosity that the current Bart Ehrman has with the former Bart Ehrman. And so here's a man who has come out of evangelicalism that liberals love to quote, because they say, there was an article in the Washington Post where the interviewer said, here's a man who peered into the Bible so deeply that he lost his faith. And they love this. The more you study the Bible, the less you're going to believe it, is the basic sense of it. Well, that's really not the case. There are some people that are like that, but by no means all or even most. When this book came out, it really created quite a storm. And he was interviewed by NPR, by multiple newspapers and magazines, and he showed up on Jon Stewart's The Daily Show. Jon Stewart, the comedian, interviewed Bart Ehrman about this book. And Stewart said, you talk about how these scribes have constantly changed the text. This is amazing. It makes the Bible feel more spiritual somehow. Well, that was a stupid statement. And then he said, I congratulate you, sir, this is one hell of a book. Now, that's a really unusual adjective to use for a book about Jesus, isn't it? But that's what he said. 2 days later, this book was #1 on Amazon. And within 3 months, it sold 100,000 copies. So here's what he has to say in it. He's an authority to this day, a well-respected authority, and I respect him very much, on the text of the New Testament. And in this book, he said, not only do we not have the originals, we don't have the first copies of the originals. We don't even have copies of the originals, or copies of the copies of the copies of the originals. This is where C.J. Werleman got his ideas. 20th generation, Werleman just made that up. And then he goes on, and towards the end of the book, he says, the more I studied the manuscript tradition of the New Testament, the more I realized just how radically the text had been altered over the years at the hands of the scribes. That sounds really ominous. It would be wrong to say, as people sometimes do, that the changes in our text have no real bearing on what the texts mean or on the theological conclusions that one draws from them. So it sounds like he's saying, my goodness, the early scribes changed the text to conform to orthodoxy. This book, Misquoting Jesus, was based on an earlier book called The Orthodox Corruption of Scripture, a very well-known academic work that Ehrman had published in 1993. And so he's arguing that these early so-called orthodox scribes changed the text to make it conform to their views of Jesus. This is where M.M. al-Azami got his ideas from. So that's the kind of the skeptical look of things, and there's some serious scholarship behind it. Never underestimate those who are the victims of the enemy. There's two attitudes that we need to avoid as we begin to look at this. The first is that of radical skepticism. That is that we can't possibly get back to the original text. There's no way we can do it because we don't have any original manuscripts. I'm going to demonstrate to you tonight that if we take that attitude, then we might as well kiss away the coming out of the Dark Ages. We know nothing about ancient Greco-Roman history, medicine, mathematics, all this, if we're going to be that kind of skeptics. It's an unreasonable, it's an irrational, and a non-empirical position to hold to. The other attitude to avoid, however, is that of absolute certainty. And that's one that I have heard some people who are favor a certain kind of a translation. They love to argue for absolute certainty. And they say, and I've heard them say this in all seriousness, if the King James Bible was good enough for St. Paul, it's good enough for me. Well, if they say that, and they're talking to me, and that's an argument they actually use, I need to begin to change the subject matter of our conversation to something that both sides can understand well. So immediately I just say, well, how about them cowboys? You know, and that's where we go with this. But you know, you all might succumb to this temptation as well. If you come to church and you bring the 1984 NIV, or the ESV, what's the translation you use here? The ESV. If you use the ESV or some other modern translations, you might say, this is the very Word of God in every single detail. No, it's not. Not in every single detail. These scholars who put these translations together recognize, as we study the text and we learn about other manuscripts and ancient evidence, that maybe we got it wrong in some places. The NIV from 1984 to 2011 has at least 2 or 3 dozen changes to the Greek text that the translators are actually translating. And they are interesting and I think meaningful changes. Whether they affect our cardinal doctrines or not is another matter which we'll get to soon enough. But we should not say, what I hold in my hands today is the very Word of God in every single respect. I can say, what I hold in my hands today is the very Word of God. But I can't say in every single respect. Well, where does that leave us? Somewhere between radical skepticism and absolute certainty, and we'll see where we should end up tonight after we answer 4 questions. So here we go. Here's the first one. How many textual variants are there? How many differences among the manuscripts do we actually have? Secondly, what kinds of textual variations are there? What's the nature of them? So the first is the number, the second is the nature. And third, what theological beliefs depend on textually suspect passages? Wouldn't you like to know if the virgin birth is secure? If it's absolutely certain in all the verses that speak about it, that there's no doubt among the manuscripts that all the scribes, even early manuscripts, say, yes, Jesus was born of a virgin. That would be kind of comforting to know that, wouldn't it? Or maybe they don't. We'll discover the answer to that question. And finally, has the essence of the Christian faith been corrupted by the scribes? The essence of the Christian faith. All right. Now, historically, my lectures tend to have a very long preface. We're still in the preface. At about 9 o'clock, 9:05, we'll be getting into the main part of it. But you weren't planning on going anywhere. The traffic here was miserable from Frisco, so I figured I'll just lecture until the traffic's all gone. So anyway, here's another prefatory comment. It's a preliminary question. Don't we have the original New Testament anymore? No, we don't. All of these manuscripts that these apostles and their associates wrote would have turned to dust by the end of the 2nd century, by AD 200. And the reason they would have is because they were copied and copied and copied. They were not written on parchment, on animal skins. They were written on papyrus, which is a far more fragile material, very much like our modern day paper, although a little bit more durable than paper. And so they would have been copied and copied and copied and worn out because of that. And so we have no original New Testament manuscripts. Well, okay, we don't have the originals anymore, but what about the copies? Don't they all say the same thing? And if they did, then the problem is solved, or at least there's nothing else we can do. If they all said the same thing, then that's what the text is that we actually print and what it gets translated into various languages. But the manuscripts don't say the same thing. If you look at even the two most closely related manuscripts from the first 8 centuries, these are known as P75 and Codex Vaticanus, which gets its name from the Vatican, where it is housed. Those two manuscripts are the most closely related New Testament manuscripts of the first 800 years. And they have between 6 and 10 differences per chapter. Now, if you extrapolate that out over the whole New Testament, that's about 2,000 differences. That's a lot of differences. And these are the most closely related manuscripts of the early period. Now, later, the manuscripts get a lot closer to each other, but that's after the first millennium, and it's just too late to help us get back to the original wording in many respects. So because of the disappearance of the originals, and because of the disagreements of the copies, we have to do what's called textual criticism, or textual research, which has to do with examining all the evidence we have and trying to get back to the wording of the original as best we possibly can. So, I have another preliminary question for you, and that is, what is a textual variant? We'll deal with this one quickly. It's any place among the manuscripts in which there's variation in wording, including word order, omission or addition of words, even spelling differences. A single letter counts as a difference among the manuscripts. And if you have, let's say in a particular verse, you've got some manuscripts that say Jesus and others that say the Lord. Let's say you have 1,000 manuscripts that say Jesus and 1,000 manuscripts that have the word the Lord. That means that there's one textual variant for Jesus supported by 1,000 manuscripts. It's not 1,000 textual variants, it's just one. Okay, now, that's all the preliminary stuff. I think it is. Now we get into the number of variants. So here we go. And by the way, this first question is going to take up the vast majority of our time. The last 3 we'll deal with quickly. The Greek New Testament has approximately 140,000 words in it. Or the critically reconstructed text that scholars use today has 138,162 words. Don't ask me how I know that, but I went to Chavez Ravine, Dodger Stadium, when I was 8 years old. My dad, I grew up in Southern California, and my dad took me to a twilight doubleheader. Some of you may know these names, Don Drysdale and Sandy Koufax. Great pitchers. We won both games, and on the way home, he was just elated. He said, "Well, tell me, son, what'd you think of the game?" "I don't know, Dad. I don't remember very much of either game, but did you know that there's 154,300 lights in Dodger Stadium and that 846 are burned out?" And so all I'd done during both games was just count the lights. So, okay, don't tell people that. That's I'm a nerd. Okay, well, we've established that. How many textual variants are there among the New Testament manuscripts? Bart Ehrman likes to say there's more textual variants than there are words in the original. That's a gross understatement. The best estimates up until this last month have been about 400,000, about 2.5 variants for every word in the New Testament. But this last month, there was a new update of about 500,000 textual variants. And the person who updated this, who did all the research, is a guy named Peter Gurry, who's getting his doctorate at Cambridge University. He's not against the faith. He's an evangelical. In fact, he's a Dallas Seminary graduate and a former intern of mine who was just trying to wrestle with how many textual variants do we really have. So that's a lot of variants. So what is that, 3.5 variants for every word in the New Testament, something like that? That's great news. Let's close in prayer. No, now I'm going to do a Paul Harvey on you and tell you the rest of the story. Oh, this is the information I'm handing. You don't need to see that. It won't show up on the exam. All right. The reason we have a lot of textual variants is very, very simple. We have a lot of manuscripts. And I'm going to give you a comparison between the number of New Testament manuscripts we have compared to the number of classical text manuscripts. Some of these very famous ancient historians and biographers of classical Greek. And you're going to see that what New Testament scholars are dealing with is an embarrassment of riches. It's absolutely stunning what the difference is. So, here we go, the embarrassment of riches. Let's talk first about how many manuscripts we have among the New Testament, for the New Testament text. The official count today is that we have about 5,000, or exactly 5,839 Greek New Testament manuscripts. Now, a manuscript can be as small as a small sliver. Some of the early papyri are no larger than a couple of postage stamps, and it can be as large as the entire New Testament. But the average size Greek New Testament is not very small. The average size is more than 450 pages long. That's average. So these manuscripts are fairly substantial overall. But this number is incorrect, and you're going to hear what the official, this is actually the non-official count, but this is the latest count. As of last month, we have added now 17 more manuscripts to the list that have not yet been officially cataloged. There's a clearinghouse in Germany that gives catalog numbers to all the Greek New Testament manuscripts. When they know about it, then all of New Testament scholarship knows about it. Until they know about it, others simply don't. Those 17 manuscripts are those that my organization, CSNTM, has discovered this last year. And so now you have the latest data. If you go to Starbucks tomorrow, and you just sit down and are drinking your coffee, and somebody comes up to you and sees you reading your Bible, you know the Bible is so corrupt, it's been copied and recopied so many times, how can we possibly get back to the original? And then that person says to you, in fact, I know there's a lot of Greek New Testament manuscripts. There's 5,839 of them. You'll need to correct them and say, no, there's 5,856. So now you have the latest data that even Münster, Germany doesn't know about yet. But it's not just Greek manuscripts. We have the New Testament translated into other ancient languages. Starting in the late 2nd century, it began to get translated into Latin, and then other manuscripts. Latin swept across Western Europe, and it became the lingua franca, the Weltsprache, the language that everybody spoke in Western Europe as Greek continued to shrink in its influence beginning in the 4th century. So we have almost twice as many Latin manuscripts as we do Greek. Well, the New Testament also got translated into other languages so that people would know what the gospel is all about. Other ancient versions or translations, we have somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000. Those are the best estimates. But frankly, those estimates, I think, are low based on the manuscripts that I've seen over the last 14 years of looking at them intently over the whole globe. But these are the numbers that I've used when I've debated with skeptics, and they're indisputed. These are conservative estimates. Now, that means we've got somewhere between 20 and 25,000 manuscripts, handwritten manuscripts, before the time of the printing press of the New Testament. That's a lot. And here's the interesting thing. If you had a magic wand, you could just wipe all those out in one fell swoop. We still would not be left without a witness. And that's because of these people known as church fathers, patristic writers, who wrote homilies and commentaries. They preached sermons. They wrote theological treatises, and they did not have the gift of brevity. They quoted and quoted and quoted and quoted from the New Testament. And they'd quote parts of it and talk about various words in verses and say, now when Paul says this is what he means. And those church fathers began at the late 1st century all the way through the 13th century. Late 1st century. In fact, some of them wrote their works before the New Testament was completed. There's a place in Germany, a converted monastery. I know it's an ironic term, but it was converted from a monastery to kind of a library research institute. And these scholars have been examining these church fathers' writings for decades now. And about 4 decades ago, the numbers hit over 1 million quotations of the New Testament by the church fathers alone. Bart Ehrman, in the book that he co-authored with his mentor, Bruce Metzger, said, you could virtually reconstruct the entire New Testament many times over on the basis of the writings of the church fathers alone. That's pretty significant. And those church fathers, as I said, go back very early, some of them. All right. Well, let's compare this to the average classical work. The average classical Greek writer has less than 15 copies of his work still in existence. And we're waiting a long time before we see those, but I'll get to that in a minute. Less than 15 copies in existence. You stack them up, they're 4 feet high. That's kind of a generous estimate. Now, how tall do you think the stack of New Testament manuscripts would be? Not counting the quotations by the church fathers, just the New Testament manuscripts in the various languages. Well, let me give you a concrete comparison. The average classical work would be about the size of a podium. This is not a very good-looking podium, but you get the idea. That's why I had to provide this much more elegant one for you. So what would we use for the New Testament? What does it compare to? Well, how about the Empire State Building? For those of you who don't know, that's in New York City. And that's a good measurement to compare it to. But this is obviously not to scale. Now, this next slide really is to scale. And when I do things to scale on these slides, it takes me a long time to get it right. So you better appreciate this. Okay, so here's that podium once again. Notice at the end of the arrow, it's coming into focus. You see it there? It's 1 pixel, and that's 4 feet tall. Empire State Building, 1,454 feet tall. Now that actually is to scale. But it doesn't tell you the reality about what the ratio is between the average classical Greek text and the New Testament. We have to have a few more Empire State Buildings, 4.5 to be precise. The actual data come to 6,600 feet tall of New Testament manuscripts. 4 feet tall for the average classical text, 6,600 feet tall, 1.25 miles high. That's unbelievable. Classical scholars would give their eye teeth to have the problems that New Testament scholars face. They say we are waiting so long before we get to see any manuscripts, and we don't have very many of them at all. And we have massive gaps in the writings. New Testament scholars will say, why don't you come over and help us, because we got way too much to look at. Now, let me compare this another way. That's just the sheer numbers. Let's talk about the date of these manuscripts. I want to compare it to Greco-Roman historians and biographers. And here's just a handful of them that are very important, and most of these are contemporaneous with the New Testament. Pliny the Elder, we're waiting 700 years before we get his first manuscript. The manuscripts that were done in the centuries between, they're gone. They don't exist anymore. 700 years. But we have about 200 from Pliny the Elder because he was a very famous writer. Plutarch, his lives, very, very important work, a great biographer, 800 years before we see a single copy. Josephus, Antiquities of the Jews. Josephus died in about the year 100, AD 100, and Josephus was a Jewish general from Galilee. I won't get into the details of Josephus. Let me just tell you this. We have 26 copies of Josephus, and the reason we do is because of his Antiquities is because Christian scribes copied out Book 18 of Antiquities more than anything else. And why did they do that? Because in that book, which is dealing with the history of the Jewish people, going back to the 1st century, Josephus mentions this guy named John the Baptist. He was not a Christian, Josephus wasn't. He mentions John the Baptist. Oh, and he also mentions this guy named James, the brother of a guy named Jesus. And then he mentions this guy named Jesus. It's remarkable. So we have 26 copies of Josephus' Antiquities because Christian scribes were faithful enough to copy them. Polybius, 1,200 years. Pausanias, 1,400 years before we get a single shred of anything from these authors. And then we have massive gaps in a lot of their writings. Herodotus, who's called the father of history, wrote really the first historiographical work in the 5th century BC. His book, Histories. It's what Luke actually patterned his gospel and the book of Acts, especially after. And for Herodotus, we're waiting 1,500 years before we get anything more than just a few papyrus leaves. 1,500 years. Then Xenophon, his Hellenica. We're waiting 1,800 years before we get more than just a few papyrus leaves. These are important, well-known historians and biographers. Now, what if the New Testament was like Xenophon's Hellenica? Our earliest copies of any substantial size written 1,800 years after the completion of the New Testament. Well, then our earliest manuscripts would be written at about the time that the Wright brothers invented the airplane. Do you think the skeptics would have a field day then? And yet Xenophon scholars don't say, we have to throw up our arms, we can't get back to the original Hellenica. They say we can get back to it largely. There's gaps, there's things we don't quite grasp. Same with all the rest of these ancient writers. They can largely get back to it. They have a good deal of confidence about that. If that's the case, with the New Testament manuscripts, we have on average more than 1,000 times as many New Testament manuscripts as the average classical Greek author does. So if they can be fairly confident that they can get back to the original, we can be 1,000 times more confident. It's remarkable. Well, what about the date of these New Testament manuscripts, though? I've talked about the date of some of these other texts. I've talked about the numbers. Now the date of New Testament manuscripts, and I want to briefly tell you about the discovery of what is still to this date the earliest known New Testament manuscript. It's Papyrus 52, or P52. This is not a prototype of an airplane after the P-51 Mustang in World War II. This is Papyrus number 52. Now, before I get to this manuscript and its date, it's just one scrap about the size of a credit card. I want to back up to the year 1844. There was this scholar by the name of F.C. Bauer, professor in Germany at the University of Tübingen, and he argued using fancy philosophical constructs to say that the New Testament took a long, long time to write, and his conclusion was that the Gospel of John could not possibly have been written before the year AD 160, and he argued, in fact, it's about AD 170. Well, that was 1844. F.C. Bauer made that claim. For the next 90 years, European scholarship followed pretty much lockstep with his views and said, yes, John's gospel is very, very late. And if it's that late, it has no historical credibility. Certainly not written by John the Apostle. And then in the year 1934, 90 years later, there was this young doctoral student, a graduate, a guy by the name of C.H. Roberts, who went to Manchester University in England, and he inherited a shoebox full of papyri that had been recently excavated. And as he was rummaging through this shoebox, he discovered a papyrus. Here's a picture of it. This is one side of it. It's written on both sides. Now, C.H. Roberts looked at this, and immediately he thought, the handwriting tells me this is pretty early. What really astounded him, though, is that it was written on both sides. Now, manuscripts at that time were written on rolls, or we would call them scrolls, and they would be written only on the inside of the manuscript. The outside would just be the outside. You'd roll this up just like toilet paper, and you write on the inside, but you probably don't write on the inside of your toilet paper. Roberts looked at this and he said, this is written on both sides. This was written on a codex. Now, for those of you who are under the age of 30, you may have never seen a codex before. JR, in a minute, I'm going to ask you to hold up your codex that's sitting next to you, just so they can see that. Not quite yet. A codex is a book form that's bound on one side and it has cut pages, and you flip it. Can you hold that to show everybody what it looks like? Your Bible. That's a codex. If you're under 30, you've never seen one of those because all you know how to do is look at books on a computer screen, and you've gone retro on us. You're really scrolling when you do that. I mean, it's really archaic technology. So a codex was invented in the second half of the first century. Now, we don't know who invented it, but what we do know is that for the first 500 years of Christianity, Christians absolutely loved the codex book form. We're not sure exactly why. 80% of all Christian manuscripts were written on a codex for those first 500 years, while only 20% of all non-Christian manuscripts were written on a codex. Now, finally, by about the year AD 500, the rest of the world caught up with Christianity, and they followed suit in the same technology. This is the first and only time where Christians have been ahead of the technological curve. But at least we did it once, and I'm grateful for that. Now, 1934, C.H. Roberts comes along. He sees this manuscript. And he would, 40 years later, write the standard introductory textbook on the birth of the Codex, which was, in fact, the title of the book. And he's the one who discovered all this thing. As soon as he saw that this was written on both sides, he said, this is a Christian manuscript. He transcribed the text. This is from the Gospel of John. Then he sent photographs of it to the 3 leading papyrologists, papyrus scholars in Europe at the time. Each one of them wrote back to him and said, this manuscript should not be dated any later than AD 150 and should be dated as early as AD 100. A fourth, a German, demurred, and he said, no, I think it might be written as early as the 90s. Now, I don't know about you. I think the education around here is pretty good. All of my kids grew up in Texas, and they got a very good education. But in Newport Beach, California, where I grew up, and when I was in class, rather than surfing, I was taught that, generally speaking, a copy of a document is not written before the original of that document. Is that something you're taught here too? Here's a manuscript that's not dated any later than AD 150. When F.C. Bauer argued that the original of John's Gospel is dated no earlier than 160. Well, what this essentially did is it sent about 2 tons of German scholarship to the flames. It put everybody in disarray. And here's a little principle that is very important for us to grasp for the Christian faith. An ounce of evidence is worth a pound of presumption. In this case, an ounce of evidence is worth about 2 tons of presumption. We have evidence on our side. That's what we need to talk about, because we have plenty of evidence for the Christian faith. Okay, this is a slide that is way too complex for you, and so we won't go through the details, but let me just lay this out, that in the first 1,000 years of the church, up until AD 1000, we have at least 967 manuscripts in Greek alone of the New Testament. A lot of times skeptics will say, well, yeah, the New Testament manuscripts, there's a lot more of those than there are of these other texts, but how many early manuscripts do you have? Well, if we look at the first millennium, we have nearly 1,000. And 100 years later, we have 1,812. This is Greek manuscripts alone. Let's compare that to classical authors. There are 4 times more New Testament manuscripts within the first 200 years than the average Greco-Roman author has in 2,000 years. Not only that, but when you start to think about how many we have over a 900-year period, we have almost 1,000 of the New Testament in Greek alone, while as within 900 years of the average classical author's writings, there are 0 manuscripts. So it's not just that we have massively more manuscripts for the New Testament, we have significantly earlier ones as well. Okay, that's a really busy slide. I apologize to your aesthetic sense. And let me conclude the first point of this lecture, and now the last 3 points we'll get through really quickly. Has the Bible been translated and retranslated so many times that we don't know what it originally said? Well, here's another way to think about this. If you go back to 1611, that's when the King James Bible was published in May. I was there. It was based, the New Testament was essentially based on 7 Greek New Testament manuscripts, the earliest of which was from the 11th century. Today we have almost 1,000 times as many manuscripts, the earliest of which go almost 1,000 years earlier. So, the bottom line here is that as time goes on, we're getting closer and closer to the original text. Is this encouraging to you? Is it helpful? Can you remember all the details? You don't need to. Just the 4 questions, and something along the line of the answers would be good. Okay, question number 2. What kinds of textual variations are there? Well, the largest category are going to be those that virtually make no difference at all. You can group them in a number of ways of thinking about those that are both meaningful and viable. Meaningful, it means it changes the meaning of the text to some degree. Viable, it has some plausibility of actually going back to the original wording. It's found in early enough manuscripts, important enough manuscripts, something like that. Over 99% of these variants, though, are either not meaningful or not viable. And the most common textual variant, remarkably, is a spelling variant. So there's differences in spelling among the manuscripts that are very, very... Hold on a sec. Okay, here we go. That's a little better. But you understood what I meant, right? In the ancient world, there were no dictionaries that told people how to spell. As a matter of fact, John, in chapter 9 of his gospel, spells the same exact verb. For those of you who know a little bit of Greek, it's the third person singular first aorist active indicative of anoigo. He spells it 3 different ways in the space of 8 verses. He was a very creative speller. My brother was a creative speller as well. He once wrote out a check to me, and he misspelled his own name. That may have been on purpose, though, because it took a little bit of time to get that check cashed. Anyway, I don't think that was John's motive. All right, so that's the most common differences. All right, now here we go. Let's talk about, I lost the screen sharing here, but I think I'm back on it, so let's take a look. All right. I got just a blank screen of here. I've been a little bit. Okay, how many ways? Here's the question I wanted to ask, and that is, how many ways are there to say John loves Mary in Greek? And I'm wrestling with the issue here of if we want to say something in Greek where the meaning doesn't change, so I'm talking about non-meaningful variants, how many ways can you say it in Greek where it's translated exactly the same way? So I chose a little phrase, 3-word translation in English, every time John loves Mary, and here's some items to consider as we think about this. First is word order differences. Greek is a highly inflected language. They don't have to put the words in the same order. You can say Mary loves John in that order, but if the endings indicate it, a Greek would say this means John loves Mary. Mary loves John, John loves, any order you want, and it's still going to mean the same thing. Then there's the Greek article, or the definite article with proper names. In Greek, it could say, the John loves the Mary. Now, we don't know why that is. There's 20,000 of these articles in the Greek New Testament. 1 out of 7 words is the word the in the New Testament. It's the first word that students learn. As soon as they learn that, I say, hey, you've got 1/7 of your vocabulary down. Great, I can read the, and that's about it. But, now, I wrote my master's thesis on when the article does not occur in the New Testament. And then I wrote my doctoral dissertation on when it does occur. Those 2 works could cure the most hopeless insomniac. And I still don't know why it occurs with proper names. It has never been an article, sorry for the pun, of doctrinal confession. Nobody's fully grasped what's going on. So you can have these words with the and without. And there's differences in spelling. The name for John in Greek is Ioannes or Ioannes. Both pronounced the same way. One has 2 N's in the middle. One has 1. Okay, so here's the question for you. How many ways do you think there are to say John loves Mary in Greek? There's 8 different ways to say this. Now, I have to put this up in Greek. If I put it in English, every one of these lines would say John loves Mary. So now you need to take out your pens because this will show up on the exam. You need to know these 8 ways. But it's not just these 8 ways. Here's another 8 ways. Every one of these sentences is translated John loves Mary. Oh, and another 8 ways, and more. These really are all different. 96 ways to say John loves Mary in Greek. Now, with conjunctions that are often untranslated, there's a few more ways to say this every time. John loves Mary, and it's the same verb for loves every time. Sorry, this will take a little time. I'll get there. There you go. 384 ways. At least that's what I came up with when I finally, after putting 8 hours to get these slides together, I thought, I think I've proved the point. So I hope you appreciate this. This took me a lot of work. Now, you say, yeah, what point? What are you trying to argue here? These are not the only ways to say John loves Mary in Greek. Other legitimate word orders swell the number to over 500, and a different verb for loves mushrooms the numbers to over 1,000. Now, you have that information. Contrast that with what Bart Ehrman says. We could go on nearly forever talking about specific places in which the texts of the New Testament came to be changed, either accidentally or intentionally. The examples are not just in the hundreds, but in the thousands. Well, he's right. They're in the thousands. We could go on practically forever, and we would be just as bored as you would be if you had to read my master's thesis and my doctoral dissertation. This is not the kind of textual variant that textual scholars ever discuss. They're not important enough. They don't affect anything. What we discuss are the ones that are both meaningful and viable. So if we can say John loves Mary over 1,000 times in Greek without substantially changing the meaning, the number of textual variants for the New Testament is meaningless. What counts is the nature of those variants. You could literally have tens of millions of variants for the Greek New Testament without changing the meaning at all. Tens of millions. To have 500,000, oh, that's just a drop in the bucket. So here's a way for us to think about the very smallest group of textual variants. It's those that are both meaningful and viable, and as I said, viable means they have a good chance of being authentic. Less than 1/5 of 1% of all textual variants fit this group. That's pretty significant. That means we got 99.8% of them are not meaningful and viable. So here's how it's visually represented. I don't know how meaningful that is to you, but this little yellow square in the corner is 1/5 of 1%. Okay, let me give you a couple of illustrations of meaningful and viable textual variants. And these are some of the more meaningful and significant variants we have in the New Testament. Just two illustrations because of time. In Mark chapter 9, verse 29, Jesus casts out a demon that his disciples had failed to cast out. And they came to him and said, "Lord, why can't we cast this kind out?" He said, "This kind can only be cast out by prayer and fasting." Notice I put "and fasting" in brackets. That's because the words "and fasting" may or may not be what Jesus actually said. They are found in later manuscripts, in most manuscripts, but in later manuscripts. The earlier ones don't have it. Now, so here's a particularly pesky kind of demon that Jesus says you at least need to pray about it to be able to cast this one out. Maybe he said pray and fast. Now, some of you may be involved in exorcisms, and if you are, then it's probably best to hedge your bet and pray and fast before you cast them out. But most New Testament scholars would say, I think we should put a period at the end of prayer. Fasting was added later. And as you can see just by looking at me, I agree with the shorter reading. All right, but enough of that. Now, something less convicting, but I am working on it. Revelation 13:18. This is a verse you probably are a little bit more familiar with. Let the one who has insight calculate the beast's number, for it is the number of a man, and his number is 666. That's the number of the beast. At least that's what almost everybody thinks. In 1841, there was a German scholar who went to the National Library of Paris, and he examined a manuscript that was from the 5th century, from the 400s, that nobody had been able to decipher before. And the reason they couldn't is because that text, that manuscript, which was originally had the entire Bible in Greek on it, was scraped clean by a scribe 800 years later, who then wrote on top of it something else. And he spent 2 years looking at the 157 leaves of this manuscript, that's all that's left of it, deciphering letter by letter, painstakingly, what this original text actually said from the 5th century. And he's the only one who was able to make out virtually all of it, 99% of it. This manuscript is known as Codex Ephraemi Rescriptus, or Ephraim the Syrian, and its Rescriptus means it was scraped again. It's called a palimpsest. Now, when Tischendorf, the fellow who discovered this manuscript or decoded it, got to Revelation 13:18, he noticed that it said the number of the beast is 616, not 666. It was the only manuscript we knew of that had the number of the beast as 616. In 2009, I had the opportunity to go to the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris and see that manuscript in the flesh for myself. And I noticed here Tischendorf, 150 years ago, writes in the very front of this manuscript, this priceless parchment manuscript, a table of contents for various books of the New Testament. Gee, if I did that today, I'd get thrown in jail for it. But he could get away with that in the 1840s. And I got to Revelation 13:18, and it was as clear as day, 616. That's what the manuscript said. But it was the only manuscript we had. However, it has become one of the two most important manuscripts for the book of Revelation. One of the two best manuscripts we have for getting back to the original text of Revelation. Even better than earlier papyri. But then, in 1998, there was another manuscript that was discovered at the Oxford University in their papyrus room. They've got about 1 million papyri that they're still trying to get translated, and they published in 98, 99, 17 more of these that were New Testament papyri. And they have this manuscript that's 26 postage stamp size fragments that are spread out over 9 chapters of Revelation. It originally had the whole book of Revelation. It's the oldest manuscript we have for this particular verse. And there's this postage stamp for Revelation 13 and 18, and it says the number of the beast is 616, just like Codex Ephraemi Rescriptus says. Now, so our oldest manuscript for this passage and one of our 2 most important manuscripts for this passage have 616. I had the opportunity in 2002, 4 years after this papyrus was published, to go to Oxford University to visit the Ashmolean Museum and see this papyrus. It was encased in between 2 plates of glass, which is always the way they protect papyri. And strangely enough, there was a piece of paper that covered the backside inside the glass. Normally, they don't do that. You get to see both sides because there's text on both sides. And the backside is the side that had Revelation 13, 18 on it. The front side, I think, was something from Revelation 14. And so I asked the curator if he would slice that up for me so I could take a look at it. And I was amazed because this was the most important and interesting textual variant in this entire manuscript. And I said, how many people have looked at this manuscript since it was published 4 years ago? Counting you? Yes, 1. So I was it. I looked at it under a magnifying glass and under a microscope, and sure enough, it said the number of the beast was 616. These are 2 extraordinarily important manuscripts. And yet, I can't tell what the original text of Revelation 13, 18 actually said. I've wrestled with this for a long time. I'm not sure which way to go. It depends what day it is, what time of day, and whether I had some cheese or not. And so, at the same time, most New Testament scholars would say, you know, we think the number of the beast is still 666. The 616, that's the neighbor of the beast. He lives a few doors down. So that's where most scholars are at. But what I don't know about any Bible college, any denomination, any church, any seminary, any theological institute that puts into its doctrinal statement, we believe in the virgin birth, we believe in the deity of Christ, we believe in the bodily resurrection of Christ, and we believe that the number of the beast is 666. It may be meaningful, it may be important, but it's not that important. And this is one of the more important ones that we have for the New Testament. Now, I've been the consultant for 4 different Bible translations. And I was the senior New Testament editor for the Net Bible and the textual critic for it. In my more carnal moments, I think about the next revision of one of these translations. I may want to suggest that we put in for Revelation 13 the number of the beast as 616. I say that's in my more carnal moments because I'm not sure if that's the original. It would send about 7 tons of popular Christian literature to the flames. If you ever Google 666, please don't do it while I'm speaking to you, but if you do, you'll see some of the nuttiest stuff that's out there, and these people are driving on our freeways. It's absolutely frightening. Okay, so that gives you a little bit of a sense of some of the kinds of textual variants that are meaningful and viable. They don't rise to the level of affecting any fundamental doctrine. Question 3, what theological beliefs depend on textually suspect passages? Again, I want to quote from Dan Brown, and he quotes from Sir Lee Teabing, who speaks to Sophie in his home. And he says, "My dear, until that moment in history, Jesus was viewed by his followers as a mortal prophet, a great and powerful man, but a man nonetheless, a mortal." Now, that time in history that he's speaking of is AD 325 and the Council of Nicaea that Emperor Constantine convened and came to for the first few days and later on. And essentially what Teabing is saying, and what Dan Brown believes, and the book that he basically plagiarized from, these others argued for as well, is that Emperor Constantine invented the deity of Christ in AD 325. Until that moment in history, Jesus was viewed as a mortal, just a man, not God in the flesh. Well, you remember an ounce of evidence is worth a pound of presumption? Let's take a look at another ounce of evidence. This is our oldest manuscript that has the text of John 1:1 in it. P66, written in about the year AD 200. And it's got most of John's gospel. It's a fairly complete manuscript. Read along with me, if you would, at John 1:1. It says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. I'm sure you've never heard that before. This is written about 125 years before the Council of Nicaea. And yet it says the same thing as the later manuscripts. Unless Constantine was, maybe a good 150 years old at that council, I don't think he could have invented the deity of Christ. And the remarkable thing is every single manuscript of John's gospel, no matter the date or the language, says virtually the same thing in John 1:1. Jesus is unequivocally called God. The same can be said for the major passages that affirm his deity, his virgin birth, his sinlessness, his death on a cross, his bodily resurrection, and his second coming, just to name a few. So, what are the doctrines that have been changed? I can't think of any cardinal doctrine that has ever been changed by any of these viable variants. The final question, has the essence of the Christian faith been corrupted by the scribes? And I'm going to quote from Bart Ehrman in conclusion, then I guess we have a 15-minute break, 10-minute break maybe, and then we'll come back and I'll stay till 8:45 tonight, JR, because I went a little bit long on the lecture. If anybody wants to stick around that long, I don't know. But anyway, Bart Ehrman, in his Misquoting Jesus, first the book came out as a hardback book in November of 2005. And then about 6 months later, they published a paperback. The sales were going well. I think it sold close to 500,000 copies by that point. But they wanted to keep the sales going, as good publishers would. So the editors put an appendix into this paperback version that people would immediately go to and see what's going on to get all the juicy quotes that they want to see that the author is making. And so they asked this question: why do you believe these core tenets of Christian orthodoxy to be in jeopardy based on the scribal errors you discovered in the biblical manuscripts? Notice what they're saying. You do believe the core tenets of Christian orthodoxy are in jeopardy. And they just assumed that that's what he had written in this book that they edited. But listen to what Bart Ehrman has to say. And this is something you need to tell your children, your family members, your friends, skeptics. This is Bart Ehrman's response to that question. Essential Christian beliefs are not affected by textual variants in the manuscript tradition of the New Testament. When they pointedly asked him that question, he could not deny the truth. In the 3 debates I've had with him, this is how I've concluded it, by quoting from his own book. Essential Christian beliefs, I can't say it any better than this, are not affected by textual variants in the manuscript tradition of the New Testament. The number one skeptic of New Testament text, Bart Ehrman, himself has admitted that. So I want to conclude with a very unnatural segue. A polar bear attacks a man in Canada, and bystanders do nothing. The media did not even report this incident. Now, many of you ate dinner shortly before you came tonight, and so it may be disturbing. I'm going to show you actual photographs of this event. So you may want to close your eyes when I put this up. But in fact, close your eyes right now anyway, because I want you to get a mental picture. Polar bears are very, very large bears. So you got this picture of a polar bear attacking a man? All right. Think polar bear attacks a man, and then think 500,000 textual variants for the New Testament. They're on the same level. Now, let's take a look at the photographs. That's not the response that statement was meant to elicit. This is telling the truth, isn't it? A polar bear attacks a man. It's true. There are 500,000 textual variants among the New Testament manuscripts. But how much damage does it cause? Didn't hurt him. May have torn out a thread of one or two of his 501 blues. But that's it. His essential blue jeans were still intact after this polar bear attack. And so thank you very much for your attention, and we'll take a break and get time for questions. Appreciate it. Okay, those are really two quite different questions, but I'll explain what the difference is. Translations have to do two things. First, they have to translate something. What is that something that they translate? And second, they have to have a method, a procedure for how to translate it, a philosophy of translation. Modern translations differ very, very little in what they are translating. They may differ significantly in how they're translating. There also ends up being within that some different interpretive issues on various passages, but I would have to say I think the most accurate translation of the New Testament today, in terms of the textual basis, it's going to be one of two. The NIV 2011 is way up there, and that's because of a fellow by the name of Gordon Fee, who is now retired. He taught at Regent College up in Vancouver, Canada, and he was the textual scholar. The NIV 2011 is the most recent one, or one of the most recent translations, and he really knew his stuff well. The second would be the Net Bible that I worked on, and I'm not listing that as first, not because I disagree with myself. Obviously, I think I do pretty decent work, but and I hope I think I'm right when I do that. But it was done in 2005, and in the last 6 years, I've changed my mind on at least one place, maybe I think two places I've changed my mind on what I think the text should say. And the NIV 2011 got at least one of those right. The other one, they may still have it wrong like I did. So,
is there time to hit on what that changed?
Yeah, it would be Mark 141 is the really key issue. And Bart Ehrman wrote a marvelous article that actually convinced me that we needed to change it. Gordon Fee and Bart Ehrman are also very good friends. Gordon Fee is a very fine evangelical scholar. In Mark 141, Jesus is about to heal a leper. And in almost every translation, it says, after the leper says, "If you're willing, you can heal me." And then in Mark, in verse 41, Jesus, the text says, because he was compassionate or feeling compassion, Jesus said, "I'm willing, be healed." Well, in very few witnesses, but important witnesses that are early, it says instead, Jesus became angry and said, "I am willing, be healed." And there's a number of reasons why I think his anger is what we have there instead of his compassion. Chief among them is that Matthew and Luke both have the same passage, and most biblical scholars would say Matthew and Luke used Mark in writing their Gospels, and yet they don't say that Jesus was compassionate. Well, if Mark says Jesus is compassionate, you'd expect Matthew and Luke to say it too, because they're using Mark. They also don't say he was angry. And in the other two places where Mark speaks about Jesus being angry, we have parallels in Matthew or Luke, and they do not say he was angry. So they leave those things out. I won't get into any of the reasons why that happens, but it's a fascinating study on that. Bart wrote an article for Gerald Hawthorne in his Festschrift, or celebrated writer, and he was a professor at Wheaton College. It's a great title. It was A Leper in the Hands of an Angry Jesus, kind of picking up on Jonathan Edwards' great sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. And he did a really, really nice piece of work. So that's what I think is going on. But what Ehrman, his basic point, here's where he and I have some disagreements. We probably agree on the text in about every place except maybe 2 or 3 dozen places. That's it. That's the only differences. So our issues are not over the text, but over the interpretation of the text. And what he says in this passage is, well, this just shows that Jesus was an angry guy, and what he means by that is uncontrollable, uncontrolled, not in control of his own anger. He got ticked off at times, very human, not divine at all. And he goes through a litany of a number of different views about why Jesus would have gotten angry. And what he argues is that none of these views is acceptable. Well, one of the things he did not look at was a doctoral dissertation done at Baylor University on that one word. It's either orgastheis or splachnestheis. Well, you don't need to know that, but because he was compassionate, because he was angry, that's one word in Greek. And a student there did his doctoral dissertation, wrote 300 pages on which word is authentic. So you want to talk about some really arcane and boring things to read, at least to some people, like all New Testament scholars except textual critics. We like that kind of stuff. So he had not seen this dissertation. The guy argued some interesting points. Here's my take on what's happened here. Mark often doesn't tell us the whole story. He leaves things to our imagination, especially he's very good at that. And sometimes he doesn't tell us the whole story unintentionally. I think this is one of those places. Earlier in the passage, it says that Jesus was preaching in the synagogues. And then we have this leper who comes up to him. I think the leper came up to him in the synagogue and potentially defiled all the people in there. Jesus was angry because the man broke the law to get Jesus to heal him. And if he had met him outside, he would not have been angry. So I think that's what's going on in that text. So again, it's a matter of interpretation. We have differences, but the text is hardly different.
My second question, how do you suggest the church use doubtful but long-standing variants like Mark's longer ending or the John's account of the woman caught in adultery?
I'm really glad for that question because it's something I had originally had in the lecture and I just felt I've taken up too much of your time, so I was hoping somebody would ask it so I could address it. There are two passages that are 12 verses long that are disputable in the New Testament. The next longest textual variant is 2 verses long. So these are really quite exceptional. The first is the longer ending of Mark's Gospel, Mark 16 verses 9 through 20. And the second is the story of the woman caught in adultery, John 7:53 through 8:11. Both of them 12 verses long. There has been what I would call a tradition of timidity for a long, long time to put both passages in our New Testaments. That tradition of timidity goes all the way back to this Greek New Testament that was published in 1516, 500 years ago. March 1st, 1516 to be exact, by a fellow named Erasmus. So we're coming up to the 500th anniversary of his publication, and I'm lecturing on Erasmus next weekend at Purdue University, then later this month at Houston Baptist University. This is the Greek New Testament that Luther had in his hands when he started the Reformation 20 months later. It's really astounding to think about this. And so this is a great year for me to reflect on it. But Erasmus based his text on 7 late manuscripts, the earliest of which was 11th century, which he barely looked at. And all of them had the long ending of Mark's Gospel, and all of them had the story of the woman caught in adultery in it. That's because the later manuscripts, which are the majority of manuscripts, have these passages. In Mark 16, the long ending is not found among Greek manuscripts, only in 2. But it happens to be the 2 oldest and what I would consider to be far and away the 2 most important New Testament manuscripts. It also is not found in some of the earliest versions or translations. And then you've got church fathers who talk about it. Eusebius, and I think there's a question about Eusebius or about the canon about Nicaea, so we'll get to Eusebius in a minute. But he was a 4th century church father who spoke about what are the 27 books of the New Testament. First one really to articulate this clearly. And Eusebius in the early 4th century says, I have not found this long ending in the vast majority of manuscripts. The great majority of manuscripts that I've looked at do not have it. They end Mark's Gospel at verse 8. The vast majority of manuscripts that exist today do have it. So what was in the majority in Eusebius' day is now a minority and vice versa. Then later in the 4th century, towards the very end of it, Jerome, who has the backing of the Vatican, the Pope behind him, is publishing for the first time a new Latin translation based on really looking at a number of Greek manuscripts. Jerome lived in Bethlehem for nearly 35 years. He moved there so he could learn Hebrew and learn the customs of Israel. And then he publishes what's called the Vulgate, which is almost to this day the official inspired Bible of the Roman Catholic Church. And Jerome said, so here we've got Eusebius early on in the 4th century saying, I don't find it in most manuscripts. Then Jerome says that he doesn't find it in most Greek manuscripts. Now, Jerome is translating from Greek, but he's translating into Latin. And I take it that there's a hint there that he found it in some Latin manuscripts especially. And so this long ending may have gotten into Mark's Gospel that way. But most scholars would say it's not authentic. These verses don't fit with Mark's style of writing. They don't fit with his syntax. They don't fit with his vocabulary. They don't fit with his theological motifs. It just doesn't seem to fit, even though it's a very, very early variant. The reason it came about, and I'll get to the question of why it's still in there and should it be, because this is kind of the background to it. The reason I think those 12 verses came about is that at Mark 16:8 it says that the angel spoke to the women at the tomb and told them to go and tell Jesus' disciples that he would meet them in Galilee. And then it says, and they did nothing for they were afraid. Period. End of the gospel. Well, that's a real downer. Why do you end like that? Now, to be very clear, Jesus was raised from the dead in the Gospel of Mark, even if you ended at verse 8. But there are no resurrection appearances by Jesus to his disciples if you ended at verse 8. Early scribes wanted to make sure to have a resurrection appearance by Jesus. And consequently, they added endings to the gospel. Not just one ending, but others as well. And there were competing endings as to how should we end this, make sure Jesus appears to his disciples. But I take it that Mark actually intended to end his gospel that way. Throughout the gospel, this is so much fun to think about when you start thinking about the literary motif and what he's trying to accomplish. Throughout the gospel, you've got Jesus telling people and demons, don't tell anybody who I is. It's the drugs talking. Who I am. And then what do people do? They go out and tell everybody else who Jesus is. At the end, the angel says, do tell the disciples about Jesus. And what do? They do nothing. So you have irony in the end. It's one of these interesting motifs. And what Mark is doing is he's bringing the reader along in his story in a very vivid telling of the story of Jesus. And right when you're ready to see him raised from the dead and make this appearance to his disciples, you get nothing. It stops right there, for they were afraid. And I take it that a reader would have looked at this, and it's an open-ended reading of the text, where they're saying, wait a minute, what happens next? Well, they knew what happened next. They knew that Jesus was indeed raised from the dead, as the angel said, and they had some of these early followers of Jesus in their very church in Rome. And so I think what Mark is trying to do is he's trying to get his readers to put themselves in the sandals of the early apostles and come to grips with who Jesus is. The church was facing persecution, and they had to ask themselves, okay, will I take up my cross and follow him every day? And what that means is, am I willing to face persecution? Taking up your cross meant your life is over. As far as you're concerned, you're dead. You're dead to the world. You follow Jesus fully. I think the way Mark ends his gospel is a very dramatic way to bring them to that conclusion. And it's not a modern invention, as some, I know I'm waxing on this one a little bit too long, but this is an important thing for us to think about, these textual variants that are of this length. It's not a modern invention to have an open-ended conclusion. There was a whole doctoral dissertation that found open-ended conclusions in ancient books, including in the Bible, like the book of Jonah. Jonah here goes, talks to the Assyrians, and he's supposed to preach the gospel, doesn't want to do it, wants to run away. He gets barfed up by a fish on the shore, and okay, I guess I'll tell him, yet 40 days, and then destruction comes. And then at the end, he's complaining about not getting enough shade in Jonah chapter 4, and he says, God, what's the deal here? And then the book just ends. And you go, wow. The reader is supposed to look at that and say, don't be like Jonah. When you share the gospel with people, even Assyrians, we don't have quite those today, but anyway, people that you don't like, people that really may have hurt your family, your friends, you have the obligation to share the good news with them, especially them. They especially need to hear it. And so there are these open-ended kinds of things that we see in the ancient literature, and what I think is really remarkable is that Mark begins his gospel with a hint about this. The beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. What do you mean the beginning? That first verse is meant to be the title of the book, as often the very first line of these ancient books were. So his gospel was called the beginning of the gospel. Well, if it's the beginning, where's the end? And I think there's an early author who picked up on that motif. Luke, when he wrote the book of Acts, volume 2 of his Luke-Acts work, what he starts out by saying in Acts chapter 1 is he speaks about the first volume that he wrote, about the things that Jesus began to do and to teach. Well, Jesus has ascended into heaven. What do you mean began to do and to teach? Luke is saying, and he's continuing to do these things and to teach these things in his apostles who continue the gospel, the good news. And so I think Luke understood what Mark was doing and emulates that same kind of style. So when you see these things, don't get upset about, oh, well, somebody wants to cut this gospel off at verse 8. No, there's a literary motif here that the author is trying to accomplish that really should impress our lives deeply about what it means to be a follower of Christ. And that, I think, is why we study the Bible the way we do, so we can really learn well what it's saying. Now, John chapter 8, the story of the woman caught in adultery, is my favorite passage that's not in the Bible. There are two questions we ask. Is this canonical? Did John really write this? But if we say no to that, we still have the question, is this historical? Did it really happen? Those are two separate questions. And a number of scholars, including Bruce Metzger, would say this has all the earmarks of historicity even though John did not write it. Here's the remarkable thing. Most of us, I think, would say, if I had to choose between one of these two passages to put in my Bible and the other one to get rid of, almost always people say, let's put the story of the woman caught in adultery in there. It speaks of Jesus' compassion, forgiving an adulteress. And let's get rid of the other one. It speaks about picking up snakes and drinking poison. And, you know, we could get rid of all those West Virginia snake handlers if we got rid of that. And you could YouTube this sometime. You'll see some really bizarre stuff, people getting killed all the time. I have stories about some of my students who went to visit a snake handler pastor. Do you really handle snakes? This guy pulls out a rattlesnake underneath his chair, sitting in a box, says, yeah, I sure do. Here's one. And, oh, my gosh. I have a deathly fear of snakes, so I don't think I would have visited that fellow. Anyway, so here's the point that I want to stress, though. The evidence against the story of the woman caught in adultery is overwhelming compared to the evidence against the longer ending of Mark. I still think it's eminently adequate to get rid of both of those passages, to say neither one is authentic. But the evidence for the the story of the woman caught in adultery is not nearly as great for its inclusion as is the evidence for the long ending of Mark. But most of us would say, I'd rather pick this passage than this. Scholars just happen to be honest about this, and they're choosing what they think is the original text on the basis of the evidence rather than emotional baggage. All right. There has been a tradition of timidity beginning with Erasmus's Greek New Testament, published in 1516, following with Tyndale's translation and Luther's, and then the King James of 1611, right up till modern translations, where we have kept those two passages in the Bible because they were in the Bible for so many years and decades and centuries. By the time we came to the conclusion, no, these really aren't authentic, we haven't found them in the oldest manuscripts, doesn't fit the style, the syntax, that kind of thing. There was a translation that came out in the 1960s that relegated, it was a major translation done by several scholars in Britain, and they relegated those two passages to the end of both of those Gospels and put them in the footnotes. And people were saying, wait a minute, where's the story of the woman caught in adultery? I don't see this in the Bible. And they didn't have any sales. It just dried up. And so the publisher said, we need to put that right back where it went because you spent a lot of time, we spent a lot of money having you do this translation. It needs to go back in there. So there's this tradition of timidity. I have been advocating for a few years now that ever since Bart Ehrman kind of let the cat out of the bag and told lay people these two passages are not authentic, especially the story of the woman caught in adultery. Everybody gasps over that one. It's important for evangelical scholars to say he's telling the truth here. It's better for you to hear it from your friends than your enemies, or those who I say are the victims of the enemy. And it's important for us to say, let's be honest about what is in the Bible. Now, the Net Bible did something a little bit different from what most translations. We put both of these passages in brackets. That's done in several translations. But we also reduced the font size by 2 points to make it harder to read from the pulpit. So there's a method to our madness. But I've been advocating that we should put it in the footnotes. It needs to be there on the page so people know this is part of the history of the text that we've had for a long time, but it's not part of the original text. So that's why it's there. And I think both Mark and John would say, why are you messing with my gospel? I wrote it a certain way and you're adding to it.
So I just want you to know that you did validate. In grad school, I wrote a thesis on that ending of Mark, and I argued that it shouldn't have been included. Thank you, but in a much less sophisticated way. And I think I only used one of your points in my paper.
Probably far briefer, too.
Much briefer. No, third
And
question.
I meant that as a compliment. I tend to be too verbose.
Third question here. How do you address the question about the missing books, Apocrypha? The Bible isn't valid because the council just left out books based on their preferences.
Okay, so did the early church get rid of certain books that really belonged in there? The Council of Nicaea is probably what this person is thinking of. That's typically the council that folks say, well, they determined what the canon should be. The canon means what are the authoritative books that go into the Bible or Old Testament, New Testament. At the Council of Nicaea, which we talked about earlier, that was AD 325. Constantine starts it. Deity of Christ was invented there, according to Sir Lee Teabing. I hope you were paying attention that I didn't agree with that. But the Council of Nicaea had absolutely nothing to do with which books go into the New Testament. And what's fascinating is Eusebius of Caesarea, who was at the council and ended up writing the biography of Constantine. The life of Constantine is what he wrote. He wrote the ecclesiastical history or church history, which tells us all of the details of what happened since the apostles right up until the year AD 324 when that was published. The Council of Nicaea happened a year later. Eusebius had not yet met Constantine when he wrote his church history. And in church history, chapter 3 or book 3, section 15, he talks about, very famously, the 4 groups of books that would be considered for canonicity. He had done a remarkable study on this. And he put them in 4 groups. One was what's called the Homolegumena. Second, Antilegomena. Third, Apocrypha. Fourth, Pseudepigrapha. The Homolegumena, these are all Greek words. They will show up in the quiz, so write those down. The Homolegumena means books that are accepted by all. Antilegomena means accepted by most, but not all. Apocrypha means books that are hidden, but Eusebius said, no, these are really not accepted by the church. And then Pseudepigrapha, these are not written by the people that it's attributed to, so we won't accept those. Now, what Eusebius did, which was, first of all, he comes up with this list before he had ever met Constantine and before he had ever had any correspondence with Constantine. The Council of Nicaea had nothing to do with it. I think that's very significant. But he came up with a list, and this is really important. By looking through the annals of church history, there was a recent book called Constantine's Bible, written by Daniel Dungan of University of Tennessee, a liberal scholar. And yet he was trying to argue for a different point. But what he pointed out in Constantine's Bible is that when Eusebius used the word homolegumena, what he meant was that is a book that was considered to be authentic, going all the way back to the very first churches that received that book. And all of Paul's letters are considered by Paul, according to Eusebius. Most of the rest of the New Testament books are considered to be by those people. Hebrews, that was iffy. Revelation, it says it's by John. Eusebius didn't think it was John the Apostle. And 2 Peter, he wasn't sure about. But so there's a few books that belong to the Antilegomena, but even those books, most churches had accepted it as authentic and as inspired. So this is before the Council of Nicaea. Now, let me add one more layer to this, or 2 other layers to it. The Roman Catholic Church says canonicity is an authoritative list of books. Protestants say it's a list of authoritative books. There has never been a universal church council that said, these are the 27 books of the New Testament, these are the books of the Old Testament. Never. The earliest council to do it was the Council of Trent, which was not a universal church council, it was just Catholic. It wasn't Catholic and Protestant, it wasn't Orthodox. The first 7 councils were all universal. And they came up with an extra 14 or 15 books for the Old Testament against the Protestant Reformation. The 27 books of the New Testament, though, emerged as obviously authentic and inspired no later than the 4th century. By the end of the 2nd century, at least 20 of those, maybe 22 of those books, were considered inspired virtually universally by everyone in the ancient church. That's just absolutely stunning. And so it is a list of authoritative books, not an authoritative list of books. They proved themselves to be authoritative and inspired intrinsically by their own self-worth. Nothing could stop them from doing this. Now, the third thing to mention is that that was certainly not the case with the pseudepigrapha and the apocrypha. And you will read some people that say, well, the early church got rid of these other books, and they'll talk about the early church had all these books that they could have put in the canon. Some people say there were 80 gospels that were circulating. Do you know how many books that we actually have written in the 1st century by Christians? We have the 27 New Testament books, and maybe 2 or 3 of the apostolic fathers' writings that we would consider to be not inspired but orthodox. We have zero of these pseudepigraphical and apocryphal works. They're early, some of them. Some of them go back to the 2nd century. None of them goes back to the 1st century. That's a huge point. And you'll read some of these scholars who say, well, early Christianity adopted some, rejected others. Yes, early Christianity, but not earliest Christianity. Earliest Christianity didn't even know about these others because they hadn't been written yet. And that's why in the 2nd century, beginning of the 2nd century, you start getting things that put titles on these books, like the Gospel according to Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Mary. Our New Testament Gospels did not have these titles. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, those names were added later, but they were universally added. The early church fathers said, yeah, this is exactly who these people are that wrote these books. And so there was no doubt among them, especially by Eusebius. But when it came to the 2nd century, now, if you're somebody who's fabricating a gospel and you want to write this book, you've got an uphill battle to fight because these canonical gospels have been around for some time. How do you get yours in circulation so it can compete with them? Well, put the name of an apostle in there, the Gospel according to Thomas. Make it the first line of the sentence of the whole gospel. That's how they try to get them in there. And that's one of the evidences that they are not authentic, is that they're putting those names on the gospels when the original ones were anonymous. So that gives you some of the arguments I would give against those.
One last question. Last question. What do you foresee as the next line of attack by liberal scholars?
Within the range of biblical studies, I think one of the major attacks that we're starting to see is it's kind of a revision of an attack that was left for dead 100 years ago, is dealing with those apostolic fathers, the 2nd generation Christians who were to some degree disciples, direct disciples of the apostles. And we have 14 books that are called the Apostolic Fathers' Writings, written between maybe as early as AD 70 up to about AD 150. And what liberal scholars are starting to do is, Bart Ehrman especially is leaning on this, is they're saying that represents only a minor stream of the early Christian church. There were other streams that would not be considered orthodox by the 4th and later century church, but they go back to the original as well. And so that's where the battle is happening. This was argued by F.C. Bauer, that famous German scholar I mentioned earlier, and his views were absolutely obliterated by J.B. Lightfoot, a great British scholar in the late 1800s. And now they're being resurrected again, as if to say the Apostolic Fathers' writings are not orthodox. They just represent one stream, and orthodoxy was simply that view that ultimately won. But it didn't win because it was true. And I'd say, wait a minute, when you really look at the evidence, they have a direct organic connection back to those apostles. And so one of the things that I have done is I've tried to anticipate where these battles are going. And so I spent 5 years with 2 of my former interns writing what's called a reader's lexicon of the Apostolic Fathers. I don't think we have it on the table because it's all in Greek, but it's meant for evangelical students to begin reading the Apostolic Fathers in Greek, because evangelicals don't do that. And we need to anticipate where the battles are going. And so that's why it took us 5 years to do this. We had 100 students proofread the work. And so you guys should get it. I mean, it would be helpful to you. But But that's where a major battle's coming, I think. So.